Let's look at an iconic European historical dagger, the stiletto. Hey folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria in Easton Antique Arms. So what I have here is a borrowed, it's not mine, stiletto, probably 17th, possibly 18th century, almost certainly Italian. And the word stiletto, as you might be able to guess, is an Italian word. So what is a stiletto, where did it come from, and who used it? Well, the word stiletto has actually been quite widely used, and many people in the modern world would think of a stiletto as something a little bit closer to this Fairbairn-Sykes dagger here from the Second World War. And indeed, that word was used in the First and Second World Wars to be applied to daggers. Now, I'd formerly thought that that was wrong, you shouldn't call them a stiletto, and that this is a stiletto. In fact, they can both be stiletto. So the word stiletto is an Italian word, as mentioned. Now, I actually looked into the etymology and roots of it, and without getting into too much depth in terms of the etymology, fundamentally the word starts being used probably in the late 15th century, certainly by the early 16th century. It's commonly being applied to certain types of thrusting dagger. We actually find it in Marozzo's treatise of 1536, Opera Nova, where he refers to a dagger that I have to say doesn't look that different to a Fairbairn-Sykes, and he's doing techniques of defense against a dagger attack. So where you're unarmed and the opponent has a dagger, they're trying to stab you in a ice pick grip, and you're doing defenses against it. Quite common for medieval and Renaissance treatises to show knife defense like this, but the dagger shown is essentially a double-edged triangular section blade, so tapering blade, like I say, not dissimilar to a Fairbairn-Sykes, probably a little bit bigger than a Fairbairn-Sykes. So the word stiletto was used in 1536 by Marozzo to apply to a stabbing dagger. However, we should also point out that the standard dagger that he features in his treatise is called the pugnale, and the pugnale is a more typical word for a dagger. So why did he use the word stiletto? Well, it seems that to him at least the word was synonymous. But looking at the etymology and its later usage, it seems that the word stiletto specifically applies to a almost thrusting only dagger. So it might have edges or it might not. It might be triangular section or square section, but it's essentially a spike. So when we see the word stiletto being used, really we should be looking at a type of dagger that is essentially almost entirely specialised for stabbing and thrusting. So as mentioned, this is a later example of the 17th, probably 18th century, and in fact this type was still around in the 19th century as well. We'll get to that in a minute. But where did it come from? We don't really know. The simple fact is that you'll find lots of different people, writers about the history of knives and just general people on the internet and in books, surmising all sorts of theories that it comes from the rondel dagger or certain other types of miséricorde or knives, daggers used for administering the coup de grace, the finishing blow, in the late medieval period. But frankly, honestly, if we actually look at the dagger, the earliest example I found is Marozzo, 1536. So we're only, 36 years into or 35 years into the 16th century there. And the dagger that's shown being referred to as a stiletto doesn't look anything like this, because this is a later style of dagger. It honestly just looks like a typical dagger. So I think that at that point in the early 16th century, the word stiletto only really applies to a particularly specialised stabbing dagger, but it doesn't necessarily, it hasn't yet evolved into this type here. And certainly we don't see this type until quite a bit later. So where it comes from, we don't exactly know. More research needs to be done, but what you could say is there were certain types of dagger which came about in the 16th century, not the 15th century. I'd say ignore the 15th century because I think that's more or less irrelevant to this point. But in the 16th century, a combination of certain types of so-called main gauche or left-hand daggers that were being used alongside swords, side swords and rapiers, in addition to those, and also specialised daggers that were being worn at the belt, kind of almost dress versions of earlier rondel daggers, and some of them were rondel daggers, but the rondels had become very small, and sometimes they just had a crossguard rather than a rondel. I think some of these are probably where the stiletto comes from, and the stiletto really actually, rather than being directly from the rondel dagger, seems to have been more of a civilian devised dagger. And I think if we look at the construction and size of the later stilettos like this, I think that's what it is heavily implied. So whatever the exact origin or combination of origins for the stiletto, this is the weapon that became really a great example of a very specialised stabbing implement that was used in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. This particular style with a metal hilt is really something of the 17th and 18th centuries, really principally of the 17th century, but it did run over into the 18th century and was used all over Europe. However, it is more of a southern European thing, so they're found more commonly in Italy. It's an Italian weapon. It seems to be an Italian-derived weapon, perhaps the south of France, and Spain as well, and Portugal sometimes as well. So it's more of a southern European thing. But of course, this was the period of great colonialism and emigration of European peoples all over the world to Asia, the Americas and Africa as well. So this went with them. So we do in fact find these in the Americas because, of course, as you probably know, huge numbers of Spanish, Portuguese and Italian people went to the Americas in this period. So these are certainly found in the Americas. Now, just before I get into the 19th century use of these and related types of dagger, I want to point out that these very early on became associated with nefarious dealings, criminals, assassins, this type of thing, because this is a small and relatively delicate stabbing weapon which is designed to have minimal resistance. They're usually either triangular or square section blades. Doesn't have any cutting edges on it whatsoever. This is exactly a square, this example. And it offers very little resistance or noise or anything else to penetrating into a target through clothing. Pretty much, I won't say useless, but not very useful as a military weapon, but very useful in a civilian scenario. So for robbing people, mugging people, assassinating people, this kind of thing, or indeed self-defense for protecting yourself. It's not a weapon that's going to be very useful in the left hand for defending against sword or rapier blows, for example. The bigger main gauche is more useful for that and has more protective guard and a bigger blade. But for concealing and stabbing people, an excellent weapon. That's what it came to be used as. Now, I've on one hand said that this is more of a civilian and in many cases criminal weapon rather than a military one, but there is an exception to that. There's the famous gunner's stiletto. Now, I've never owned one of these. I've never even handled one actually, but I have seen them in museums and you can find them. They're not that uncommon. And one of the interesting things about the gunner's stiletto is that they have essentially a measure, a ruler along the blade. So they have little lines and numbers for you to be able to measure the depth of things. Allegedly powder. I don't know how good of an idea it is to jam a steel blade into powder, I don't know, but essentially used as a measure. And these gunner's stilettos used for measuring, it could have been for other things, as measuring other things as well, were therefore also a tool and theoretically a self-defense weapon. But allegedly, again, allegedly, I've also heard that they were used for cleaning out the touch holes in artillery pieces. So as a general purpose tool, spike, and a dagger, these were popular with gunners, with artillery in the 17th and right the way through to the, I think, the early 19th century. Now, just a question about how to use these. So clearly, pretty much any knife or dagger can either be used point down in an ice pick grip or point up in what we could call a sword grip. Now, something I've noticed with the stiletto is it has such a spindly and thin little grip. You don't need to worry about edge alignment because there are no edges. However, it's quite a short grip. You look at the length of it compared to my hand. It's quite a short grip. You can only just about get your hand on and only just about see the pommel, if you want to call it that, sticking out of the end. But it's also very thin and it's really quite small to hold. It's as thin as a pencil or like a biro. So I actually find these quite fiddly to hold. Now, there's a couple of, I think point up is much more easy than point down. Point down, you don't really have a lot of options. What I would advise doing is putting the thumb over the top to prevent it ramming, that guard ramming into your pinky finger there. So that the most secure way to grip it would be that, but it doesn't feel good. Although you might think as a stabbing implement they were probably used a lot like that, in reality, it doesn't feel good that way. It feels much better this way around. Now, the two main ways that I've found to grip it that seem more secure are to actually place the thumb on the flat of the blade, if we call it that. It's not really a flat, but on the ricasso, on the side of the guard. Now, this is how left-hand daggers were held when using them in conjunction with a rapier or a sword. because the crossguard points out sideways, and for parrying an opponent's thrusts or even cuts sometimes, this is the more secure way because the blows will slide down the blade and come on the cross here, so you can both protect and stop, but you can also control. So if a thrust comes in and you parry outwards with the guard there, you've got this V in which the blade is momentarily trapped for long enough for you to push it aside and bring in your own sword thrust. So this is both historically backed up and also feels the most natural in the hand, to put it up the thumb at the side there. But I've also noticed something else. So when stabbing with these, you wouldn't meet much resistance. So you're not likely to have that guard slamming into your hand hard unless you happen to hit something hard, like a breastbone or something that it might be wearing, like a medallion or a button or something like this. But I have noticed that these feel a lot more secure to hold if you put one or even two fingers over the top of the guard. Now, if you look at the guard, if you actually look at the form of that guard, it doesn't look particularly like a guard. It actually looks like another piece of grip. So here's a theory for you. Is it possible that actually this guard is, don't think about it as a guard so much, just think about it more like an ergonomic part of the gripping device, a bit like an ergonomic grip on a modern fencing foil, for example. So if we integrate it with our grip here, this dagger now becomes very locked in, and then we can place the thumb up along the blade as well. This becomes completely locked into the hand and it can't move in any direction. And we've still got enough blade here to get easily enough penetration to where we want to go to. So possibly, I think, it would certainly if I was using this, and that gets over the fact that you've got quite a short grip, it brings the hand further up the grip because you've now only got 3 fingers on the grip instead of 4. So I actually think that this is a very plausible way that stilettos were used. And also think about concealability. If you're defending yourself or attacking someone in the 17th century, and then actually putting your entire hand around the hilt hides the weapon even more. All you can now see of it is this thin little shank, and if you're holding this down by your side or underneath a piece of clothing, they are not going to notice that spike until it goes into them. Whereas if you hold it all the way down here, this is now a very much more visible object with the cross above your hand. If you integrate the cross into the hand, it's a more secure grip, can't move forwards or backwards, and it's hidden inside the hand. And you don't really need a hand guard with a weapon like this, because you're not like using it to fence against another person's weapon, you're just shanking them. It's a shank. So that's my theory on how to grip it. So going into the 19th century, there were various forms of so-called stilettos. Some of them were still like this, but I have to say some of them started to be more edged things that look a little bit more like a Fairbairn Sykes here. Usually with slightly longer guards than that. And we should also mention in this period, so if we're talking about essentially the Napoleonic period in military terms, we also have naval dirks. Now if you look at naval dirks, a lot of naval dirks are essentially like a stiletto. They often have stiletto-like blades. They're usually a bit bigger than this. Sometimes they have grips, or hilts rather, which are a bit more like a rondel dagger with a disc, but very often they have a crossguard. So actually in function, a lot of naval dirks of the 18th century and into the early 19th century look like stilettos and probably were used in exactly the same ways. Which I think is kind of funny, because on one hand we think of the stiletto as the kind of criminal and, assassin's weapon, but then you've got like junior naval officers wearing them on board, Royal Navy or French or Spanish Navy ships, which are kind of opposite ends of the social spectrum. And anyway, something interesting to consider there. But in functionality, a naval dirk is really very similar to a stiletto. Now, an interesting little nugget of information is that in many parts of America and Canada and other colonial places in the 19th century, there was a lot of crime. Crime was very high. And one of those places was New Orleans. And New Orleans was famous for dueling. It was famous for fencing schools. A lot of people carried knives, Bowie knives and other types of knife. But a lot of people carried stilettos. Now, there were lots of people in New Orleans, obviously French, but there were also lots of Italians, Spanish and various other nationalities there. And it was such a problem. A lot of people think about modern weapon rights, and you talk about, knife bans in the UK, or you talk about, access to firearms and stuff like that. A lot of people think about America as being a bastion of liberty as far as weapon rights are concerned. But what's interesting is there were actually a lot of anti-weapon legislations passed in 19th century America. As I've pointed out many times in the past, in Texas, it was made illegal to carry a Bowie knife around because of the number of people or Bowie knife if you prefer me to say. There were so many people carrying Bowie knives and stabbing each other with Bowie knives, more so than killing each other with guns. And so guns in the 19th century were less of a problem than knives. A lot of people who'd gone out there, poor immigrants with nothing but the shirt on their back, working in mines, this kind of stuff, they didn't have the money to buy a firearm, but they had the money to buy a knife. And there was a lot of regulation against firearms in certain towns and cities at that time, contrary to the Wild West myth. But knife violence was such a problem in New Orleans in the 19th century that in 1879 they banned stilettos. They forbade the sale, advertising and carrying and sale of stilettos specifically. Now, they probably didn't mean exactly this type of 17th century stiletto. They probably actually meant more things like this. But regardless, it shows that knife violence, particularly amongst certain southern European communities, as far as I can tell, knife violence was so such a big problem that they decided there needed to be a legal measure. So stiletto sales were banned in 1879. Of course they went on, of course people still carried them and still had them, but it shows that it was a problem, and stilettos, whatever form that took, were a problem. Now the final thing to mention, of course, is World War I, and you could say World War II to an extent as well, and that is trench knives. When we come into the 20th century, suddenly we find soldiers in the trenches of Western Europe and Eastern Europe who found themselves in need of fighting knives. And some of these fighting knives, some of the British, French, Belgian, Italian, German and other fighting knives did have close relationships with the stiletto, and some of them have stiletto type blades, and in fact some of the bayonets in use, I mean, if you look at a typical triangular bayonet, the blade is basically like a stiletto. So many of the bayonets being used, like the Libelle bayonet for example, have a stiletto-like blade. Okay, they're essentially a spike, and of course this just simple spike blade, cheap to make, no real maintenance required, and it does the job. Particularly, it has to be said, through thick uniforms and winter clothing and stuff like that. So it continued into the 20th century. So the stiletto, there we go. There's some theories of mine about how to hold them, possibly where they came from, although I think there's more research needing done on that. And really, just to bear in mind, this is what, when you say stiletto, this is what I think of. But actually the word stiletto applies to broader bladed double-edged daggers in Marozzo, for example, 1536, and all the way through to the early 20th century, when this term stiletto was still being applied to things like the Fairbairn Sykes and the V42 and various other types of fighting knives still in use. So the stiletto, really a sharpened spike, and anyone could make one. If you've got access to steel and a grinder, or just a hand file, anybody could make a stiletto. There is nothing complicated about this spike, and yet it's one of the longest lived, most successful weapons of the last 500 years. I think it deserves a little bit more attention and credit than it gets. I hope this has been interesting, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.